Chapter 9. Isaac. He did it again. 20 years after Egypt. 20 years of God's faithfulness. The covenant sealed in blood and fire. The promise confirmed by the visitor at Mamre. Sarah already carrying the impossible child in her 90-year-old body, though she didn't know it yet. And Abraham lied again. The same lie. The same fear. The same words. "She's my sister," Abraham told Abimelech. A different king, a different kingdom, a different decade. The same fear underneath it. I stood on the perimeter and heard the words come out of his mouth, and I felt something crack inside me that I thought the Egypt crisis had already broken. It hadn't. There was more to break. I still catch myself on the names. Abram and Sarai, the names I'd known them by the longest. Then God gave them new ones: Abraham, Sarah. Father of many, mother of nations, new names for the new thing he was making them into. And here was Abraham, carrying a name that meant a multitude, lying about his wife the same way Abram had. The name was new, the fear was old. Abimelech took Sarah. The machinery of power grinding into motion the same way it had in Egypt, officials and servants, and the administrative process of a king claiming a beautiful woman from a household that had presented her as available. I sent word to Michael, mobilized the detail, took my position around the royal compound. The muscle memory of Egypt still lived in my body, and I was already bracing for 3 days of sustained fighting when God moved. He moved fast, faster than Egypt, faster than I'd ever seen him intervene in a human crisis. God appeared to Abimelech in a dream that same night, not through angels, not through signs, directly. "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Abimelech protested, "Rightly. Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? He told me she was his sister, and she herself said he was her brother. I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." And God acknowledged it. "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife." One night, Sarah was returned by morning, untouched, unharmed. The crisis that had taken 3 days and desperate warfare in Egypt was resolved in hours because God decided not to wait this time. Abimelech confronted Abraham, and for the second time, a pagan king answered for himself with cleaner hands than the man who carried the promise. "What have you done to us?" Abimelech said. "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham's answer was the answer of a man who knows his excuse is inadequate before he finishes giving it. I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. The fear, always the fear. The same root, producing the same fruit, 20 years apart. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. But underneath the anger was a weariness I didn't think I had room for. This was who Abraham was. A man of real faith who still kept room for the same old fear, and that room never emptied no matter how many times God proved it unnecessary. Michael found me after Sarah was safely returned. "Don't say it," I said. "The promise doesn't depend on Abraham being perfect," Michael said anyway. "I know," I said. "It depends on God being faithful. I've heard the speech." "Then why are you angry?" Michael asked. "Because he should learn," I said. 20 years, covenant, promise, fire from heaven. The visitor at his tent telling him Sarah will have a son within the year. And he lies about her again. He puts her in danger again. Shouldn't decades of God's faithfulness produce some change? Michael was quiet for a moment. "It should," he said. "But even when it doesn't, God's plan doesn't stop. That's what makes it grace, Camille. If God only worked through people who never repeated their mistakes, he'd work through no one." Grace. I was starting to hate that word. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was so expensive. Every time Abraham's fear surfaced, someone else paid. Sarai in Egypt, Sarah in Gerar, the angels who mobilized. The promise itself, dangling over another king's household while the chosen man sat with his lie and waited for God to clean up what his fear had set loose. Then Isaac was born. The morning started like any other. Cook fires lit, servants moving through routines, flocks led to pasture. I was on the eastern perimeter, driving off a low-ranking fallen who'd been circling since before dawn, when I felt the shift. Not a spiritual shift, a physical one. Something in the camp changed. The rhythm of movement altered. A servant ran between tents, then another. Sarah's midwife ducked through the tent flap, and even from my position on the perimeter, I could hear the urgency in her voice. Then angels began arriving. Not from nearby, from the upper regions, from distant posts, from assignments across the earth. They came in ones and twos and then in dozens, converging on Abraham's camp with a focus I hadn't felt since the covenant vision. The word was spreading through the ranks of heaven faster than any message I'd seen carried. Angels who hadn't thought about Abraham's story in years, suddenly focused, suddenly present, suddenly aware. Sarah had conceived. Sarah, who was 90 years old, whose body had passed every possible threshold. Who had prayed at a stone in Ur until her hands wore it smooth, then stopped, then started again. Who had schemed with Hagar and laughed when the visitor made his promise. Sarah was giving birth. Abraham was 100 years old. He stood outside the tent because the midwife had told him to wait outside, and he was obeying the midwife with a meekness he didn't always show God. He paced. 3 steps to the left, 3 steps to the right. His hands shook. His lips moved in prayer, whispering to God with a desperation that was also joy, because the impossible was happening, and he could hear it happening, and every sound from inside the tent was proof that God kept his word. I moved closer, left the perimeter. I shouldn't have. But I'd been guarding this promise for decades, fighting for it in Egypt, holding the line for it in the heavenlies, carrying it through silence and failure and the long, grinding wait. I wasn't going to stand at the boundary and file a report while it was being fulfilled 50 paces away. The darkness burn on my arm went quiet. Not the usual ache easing, just quiet. Sarah cried out, not in pain, in effort. The sound of a woman doing the hardest physical work of her life. 90 years old. Her muscles and bones and blood performing what they'd been designed to perform, past any point any midwife would have said was possible. Then the cry came. A newborn's first breath. Pulled from lungs that shouldn't exist, drawn into a body that every natural thing said was impossible, announced to the world with the particular sharp wail that every human child makes when they arrive. I'd seen creation. I'd watched God shape Adam from dust and breathe life into his nostrils. I'd watched Eve formed from Adam's side. I'd witnessed the first animals take their first steps, and the first birds discover flight. But there was something about this cry, this specific cry from this specific child, that hit me differently than all of those moments. 25 years of waiting was in that sound, all of it. The lies and the fear and the barren decades and the scheme with the handmaid and the covenant sealed in blood. The midwife emerged from the tent. Her hands were bloody, and her face said everything. A son, the midwife said. Abraham's face. I need to describe it because I've been watching this man's face for decades, and I've seen fear on it and faith on it and shame and determination and the quiet grief of a man watching his wife age past every hope. But I'd never seen what I saw when the midwife said those words. It wasn't one emotion. It was all of them at once, collapsing into each other. He went into the tent. I know I shouldn't have, but I went after him. Abraham picked up his son. Those hands that had built altars and pressed flat in prayer in the dark lifted a newborn out of the midwife's arms and held him against his chest. The boy was small and red and wrinkled, and he was screaming, and Abraham held him, and his whole body shook with a tremor that started in his hands and moved through his arms and his shoulders and didn't stop. He named him Isaac, laughter, because Sarah had laughed when the visitor promised, because Abraham had laughed when God confirmed it years before that. The name carried all of that. Their doubt became what they called their son. Whack, Sarah held him. I stood near enough to see her face, and what I saw there, I'd been watching her build toward for decades. Not just relief, not just happiness. Completion. The face of a woman who'd been given back the thing she'd stopped believing could happen. Her hands, the hands that had worn a prayer stone smooth in a courtyard in Ur, cupped around the head of her son. Her fingers traced his face, his forehead, his nose, his mouth, as if she were memorizing him, as if she were afraid he'd disappear if she stopped touching him. God has brought me laughter, Sarah said, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Angels gathered not to fight, but to witness, to mark the moment when the seed promise survived another impossible generation. I felt them above me in layers, silent and attentive, the weight of heaven's attention pressing down on this tent and this crying child. The upper regions were celebrating. I could feel it in the resonance that traveled between the gathered angels, something that wasn't sound but carried the joy anyway. The fallen had gathered too, on the perimeter, watching. Sariel was among them, and I looked for his face and found it, not rage, not the sharp calculation I'd grown used to, something quieter. The expression of a strategist watching an outcome he'd calculated against become real. The promise had seemed impossible. He'd built everything on it, never happening. And now a woman well past bearing age was nursing a son, and the calculation had failed. I let myself feel the joy fully, without reservation, without the careful hedging I'd been practicing since Egypt, the self-protective habit of not believing too much, because the next failure was always coming. Isaac was real. Isaac was breathing. The seed continued. For the first time since the garden, I felt something that wasn't complicated by confusion or grief or the weight of watching humans fail. It was pure joy, the simple, clean recognition that God had done what He said He would do, and I let it stand alongside everything else I was carrying. Isaac grew. Months became years. He learned to walk on the packed earth outside Abraham's tent, his first steps taken between his father's outstretched hands. Abraham kneeling in the dirt with his arms open and his face wearing an expression of terror and delight that I'd never seen combined in a human face before. He learned to talk, his first word, not father or mother, but the name of the goat he'd adopted as a pet, which made Abraham laugh so hard that tears ran down his cheeks. He learned to run through the camp with the careless energy of a child who doesn't know he's carrying the weight of a promise on his small shoulders. Past the servants, between the tents, around the livestock pens, always moving, always shouting, always filling the camp with the noise that had been missing from Abraham and Sarah's tent for decades. Abraham watched him with an expression that made my chest tight. The fierce, terrified tenderness of a man who has waited 100 years for something and now lives in terror of losing it. I'd see him standing at the altar in the morning, and instead of looking at the sky the way he used to, his eyes would drift toward the tent where Isaac slept, as if checking, as if confirming, as if every morning he needed proof that the miracle was still real. When Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a celebration. The camp gathered. Food and music and the particular human joy of watching a child grow towards something and everyone knowing it. And in the middle of it, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking. I saw it too. Ishmael was a teenager now, old enough to understand what Isaac's existence meant for his own future. The promised son, the legitimate heir. Everything Ishmael might have been if the scheme with Hagar had been God's plan instead of Sarai's impatience. He watched Isaac at the center of the celebration, and his face carried the expression of a boy who has been displaced by a miracle. The mocking wasn't simple cruelty. I'd seen that look before, in fallen angels who mocked what they'd lost. Ishmael understood what Isaac's existence meant, and it showed in his face. Sarah saw it, and her response was immediate and absolute. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," Sarah told Abraham. "That woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Abraham's face when he heard those words, the grief in it. He loved Ishmael, not as the promised son, not as the covenant heir, but as his firstborn, the boy he'd held and named and watched grow for 13 years. Sending Ishmael away wasn't a decision, it was an amputation. God spoke to Abraham that night. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Through Isaac, not Ishmael. The line was clear, the covenant was specific. And Ishmael, the son who existed because humans tried to help God's plan along, would be blessed but separate. A nation, but not the nation. Loved but not chosen. Abraham rose early the next morning. Before dawn, before the camp stirred. He took bread and a skin of water, and he found Hagar in the servants' quarters, and he placed the provisions on her shoulder himself. His hands on her shoulder, the hands that had held Isaac, the hands that had built altars, the hands that shook when the midwife said, "A son." Those hands placed a skin of water on the shoulder of a woman he was sending into the desert, and they lingered there for a moment before he let go. He didn't say much. I don't think he could. Ishmael stood beside his mother, a boy old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to be unable to stop it. Abraham looked at his firstborn, put his hand on the boy's head, held it there. Then he turned away, and his shoulders carried the specific shape of a man who has obeyed God and hates the cost. I watched them go. Hagar, walking into the wilderness of Beersheba with a teenage son and a day's worth of supplies and a future that had just been redefined by someone else's promise. She didn't look back the way Lot's wife had looked back at Sodom. She walked forward. The water ran out. I followed at a distance because I couldn't not follow. This wasn't my assignment. Isaac was my assignment. But Hagar and Ishmael were walking into the desert to die, and I couldn't watch from Abraham's camp and pretend the distance made it someone else's problem. Hagar put Ishmael under a bush. She sat down a bowshot away because she couldn't bear to watch her son die, and she wept. The sound of it carried across the dry ground. A woman who had run out of options and knew it. God heard the boy crying. Not Hagar's weeping, the boy's crying. Ishmael. God hears. The name his mother had been given before he was born, spoken by the angel who found Hagar the first time she fled into the wilderness, years ago, when she was pregnant and desperate and running from Sarah's cruelty. God heard him again. "What is the matter, Hagar?" the angel said. "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw the well. It had been there all along. Water, 10 steps from where her son was dying. Provision that existed before the crisis, waiting to be revealed at the moment it was needed. I watched them drink. Watched Ishmael pull himself upright and drink with both hands, the crisis moving through his body and out the other side, the way a storm passes, leaving him spent but breathing. Watched Hagar fill the skin and hold it to her son's mouth a second time, and then a third. And look at the sky with an expression that contained every question and no answers, and a gratitude that didn't need answers to be real. The covenant ran through Isaac. But God's care didn't stop there. I was watching it. The same God who had chosen Isaac, who had narrowed the promise to one specific child, was also providing for the child who wasn't chosen. Not with the covenant, not with the promise, but with water in the desert and a future and a nation of his own. I returned to Abraham's camp. Isaac was playing near the tent, laughing, the sound carrying across the camp the way it had every day since he learned to run. Abraham sat at his altar, and when I saw his face, I saw both sons in it. The joy of the one who was here and the grief of the one who was gone. Both real, both permanent, both the consequence of choices that couldn't be unmade. The fallen watched from the perimeter, patient, calculating. Isaac was small and mortal and fragile, and they had been fighting this war long enough to know that fragile things break. But I'd waited 25 years for that laugh, and the darkness burn on my arm ached less when I heard it than at any other time since the heavenly battle. I took my position, established the perimeter, and for the first time in a long time, I settled into the watch without bracing for what would break it.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.